Inside Allan B. Polunsky Unit Prison. The prison built for finality. There is a prison in East Texas designed not for rehabilitation, not for reintegration, but for permanence. Most of the men held here will never walk free. Some will never again touch another human being. This is the Allan B. Polunsky Unit, the primary death row prison for the state of Texas. It is one of the most secure correctional facilities in the United States. It houses individuals convicted of capital murder. And it is where Texas carries out the longest-standing death penalty system in the modern era. Yet despite its central role in American criminal justice, what happens inside Polunsky is rarely seen, rarely filmed, and often misunderstood. In this documentary, we are going inside, not through rumor or speculation, but through verified records, court filings, official policy, and first-hand reporting. What is daily life like inside Texas death row? How did this prison come to define capital punishment in America? And what happens to a person when confinement becomes permanent? To understand Polunsky, we need to start with why it exists at all.
Before we dive into today's powerful story, don't forget to hit that like button and subscribe for more gripping tales. Your support helps us keep sharing these stories, and we wouldn't want you to miss any of the action. Now, let's get started.
Where Polunsky stands in Texas. The Allan B. Polunsky Unit is located near Livingston, Texas, in Polk County, a rural region roughly 75 miles northeast of Houston. The prison is operated by the Texas Department of Criminal Justice, or TDCJ, the largest state prison system in the United States. Texas incarcerates more people, and executes more prisoners, than any other U.S. state. Since the resumption of capital punishment in 1976, Texas has carried out more than 570 executions. The majority of those individuals were housed at Polunsky before their deaths. This makes the prison more than just a correctional facility. It is a logistical center of capital punishment. But Polunsky was not always synonymous with death row. Why Polunsky was built? The Allan B. Polunsky Unit opened in 1994. At the time, Texas was facing a growing death row population. Inmates sentenced to death had previously been housed at the Ellis Unit, a facility not designed for long-term, high-security isolation. Federal court rulings in the late 1980s and early 1990s raised concerns about overcrowding, safety, and constitutional conditions on death row. Texas responded by building a facility specifically engineered to hold death-sentenced prisoners indefinitely. Polunsky was designed from the ground up for control, containment, and isolation. Its original name was the Terrell Unit. It was later renamed in honor of Allan B. Polunsky, a former chairman of the Texas Board of Criminal Justice who played a major role in expanding the state's prison system. From its opening, the unit was intended to house the most restricted population in Texas custody. The role of Polunsky today. Today, the Polunsky Unit serves three primary functions. First, it houses male inmates sentenced to death in Texas. Second, it holds individuals classified as administrative segregation, meaning they are deemed a high-security risk. Third, it temporarily confines prisoners awaiting transfer or disciplinary review. But its most defining role is death row. Almost all men sentenced to death in Texas are sent to Polunsky, where they remain until one of three outcomes occurs. Their sentence is overturned or commuted. They die of natural causes. Or they are executed by the state. Executions themselves do not occur at Polunsky. Instead, inmates are transported to the Huntsville Unit, where Texas's execution chamber is located. But Polunsky is where death row inmates spend the vast majority of their sentence, often decades. Security level and design. Polunsky is classified as a maximum security prison. The design reflects that classification in every detail. Cells are constructed of reinforced concrete and steel. Doors are solid, not barred. Movement is tightly controlled. Surveillance is constant. Death row inmates are housed in single-occupancy cells, each measuring approximately 60 square feet, roughly the size of a small bathroom. Inmates eat, sleep, and spend nearly all of their time inside these cells. Unlike general population units, Polunsky does not operate on open movement schedules. Inmates are escorted by correctional officers whenever they leave their cells. This design is intentional. According to TDCJ policy, death row prisoners are considered escape risks due to the severity of their sentences. The assumption is that individuals facing execution have little to lose. As a result, the unit prioritizes control over flexibility. Life on Texas death row. For most death row inmates at Polunsky, life follows a strict and repetitive routine. Prisoners are typically confined to their cells for 22 to 24 hours per day. Out-of-cell time, when granted, usually consists of solitary recreation, one inmate at a time, in a small, enclosed yard sometimes referred to as a dog run. Human contact is limited. Meals are delivered through a slot in the cell door. Conversations with other inmates, if they occur at all, happen by shouting through walls or ventilation openings. Physical contact with family members is prohibited. Visits, when approved, take place behind glass partitions. This level of isolation has been the subject of legal challenges and psychological research for decades. However, Texas courts have consistently upheld the state's death row housing practices as constitutional under current law. Who lives here? The men housed on death row at Polunsky come from across Texas. They were convicted in different counties, by different juries, under different circumstances. Some cases involve multiple victims. Others involve a single homicide combined with legally defined aggravating factors, such as murder committed during a robbery or the killing of a law enforcement officer. What they share is not a single type of crime, but the same legal outcome, a death sentence under Texas law. As of the early 2020s, Texas's death row population has declined significantly from its peak in the late 1990s, when more than 450 inmates were housed under death sentences. Despite the decline, Polunsky remains one of the largest death row facilities in the United States. The long wait. One of the defining features of life at Polunsky is time, not just how much of it inmates have, but how slowly it passes. In Texas, the average time between a death sentence and execution is more than a decade. Many inmates wait far longer. During that time, they move through a complex appeals process involving state courts, federal courts, and, in some cases, the U.S. Supreme Court. While these legal battles play out on paper, daily life inside Polunsky changes very little. Cells remain the same. Schedules remain the same. Isolation remains the same. For some inmates, the wait ends with an execution date. For others, it ends quietly, with a court order, a commutation, or death from illness or age. But for everyone on death row, uncertainty is constant. Setting up what comes next. Polunsky is not just a prison. It is a system designed around final judgments, and the possibility that those judgments may take decades to carry out. In the next part of this documentary, we will go deeper inside. How death row conditions became the subject of national legal battles. What inmates are legally allowed, and denied, while awaiting execution. And how the psychological toll of isolation has shaped some of the most significant court cases in Texas history. Because to understand Polunsky fully, you have to understand not just the walls, but what prolonged confinement does to the people inside them. A day measured in minutes. A day that never really changes. Inside the Allan B. Polunsky Unit, days are not marked by events. They are marked by procedure. For men on Texas death row, there is no work assignment, no educational program, and no movement through a typical prison schedule. Each day follows nearly the same pattern as the one before it. Wake up does not come with a bell or announcement. Inmates wake when the lights come on, or when they have slept enough to realize nothing has changed. The cell is where the day begins, and almost always where it ends. The cell itself. The standard death row cell at Polunsky is small, functional, and deliberately sparse. Each cell contains a concrete bed platform, a thin mattress, a combination stainless steel toilet and sink, a narrow writing surface, overhead lighting controlled externally, a solid steel door with a small window and food slot. There are no bars. There is no personal control over lighting or temperature. Inmates are permitted a limited number of personal items, which may include legal papers, religious texts, correspondence, and approved hygiene items. Everything inside the cell must comply with strict security regulations. Items can be removed at any time during inspections. The cell is designed not for comfort, but for containment. Meals on death row. Meals at Polunsky are delivered directly to the cell. Inmates eat alone. Food is prepared centrally and distributed on standardized trays. The diet meets basic nutritional requirements as defined by state policy and federal law. There is no communal dining. There is no choice menu, aside from medically or religiously required accommodations. For death row inmates, meals become one of the few recurring events that break the silence of the day. According to inmate interviews and court filings, the sound of the food slot opening is often the only guaranteed human interaction most prisoners experience daily. Movement under escort. Whenever a death row inmate leaves his cell, for recreation, medical care, or visitation, he does not move freely. He is escorted. Standard procedure involves restraints, including handcuffs and, in some cases, additional security devices depending on classification. Movement is staggered so that inmates do not cross paths. This level of control is not incidental. It reflects TDCJ's position that death row inmates represent a unique security risk. The result is a prison environment where silence and separation are enforced structurally, not just socially. Recreation, alone by design. Recreation on death row does exist, but it is solitary. When permitted, inmates are escorted to individual outdoor enclosures, often referred to as recreation cages. These spaces are small, enclosed by concrete or fencing, and designed to prevent contact with other prisoners. Recreation typically lasts 1 to 2 hours, depending on staffing and security conditions. There is no exercise equipment. No shared yard. No group activities. For many inmates, this brief exposure to open air is the only time they leave their cells for days at a time. Visitation without touch. Visitation at Polunsky is strictly controlled. Death row inmates may receive visits from approved family members, attorneys, and clergy. Physical contact is not allowed. All visits occur behind glass partitions, with communication through phones or intercom systems. Visits can be suspended due to disciplinary issues, staffing shortages, or security lockdowns. For many inmates, these visits are their only connection to the outside world, a world that continues moving while their own remains static. Medical and mental health care. Medical care at Polunsky is provided by the Texas Prison Health System, which contracts with medical professionals to deliver constitutionally required treatment. Inmates receive routine medical evaluations, prescription medication when indicated, and emergency care when necessary. Mental health services are available, but their scope has been a central point of controversy. Death row inmates are assessed for mental illness, and those diagnosed may receive counseling or medication. However, critics, including mental health experts and civil rights organizations, have argued that prolonged isolation itself exacerbates psychological harm. Texas officials have maintained that services provided at Polunsky meet legal standards. Courts have repeatedly examined these claims, with mixed outcomes depending on jurisdiction and case specifics. The psychological toll. Psychologists have long studied the effects of extended isolation. Symptoms associated with long-term solitary confinement can include anxiety, depression, hallucinations, difficulty concentrating, and emotional instability. Multiple death row inmates from Polunsky have described struggling with these effects in sworn affidavits and interviews. However, Texas courts have generally ruled that isolation on death row, as practiced at Polunsky, does not automatically constitute cruel and unusual punishment under current constitutional interpretations. This legal distinction, between documented psychological harm and constitutional violation, sits at the center of ongoing debate. Legal challenges from the inside. Polunsky has been the subject of numerous lawsuits. Inmates have challenged conditions of confinement, access to mental health care, restrictions on exercise, the cumulative effects of isolation. Some cases have resulted in policy adjustments. Others have been dismissed or overturned on appeal. One consistent theme runs through decades of litigation: courts defer heavily to prison administrators when security concerns are invoked. As a result, meaningful changes to death row conditions have been slow and incremental. The human clock. Time on death row is experienced differently. There is no sentence countdown. No release date. No guaranteed end. Some inmates have lived at Polunsky for more than 20 years. During that time, appeals move forward, or stall, while daily life remains unchanged. For some, hope comes in the form of legal arguments. For others, it fades into routine. The prison does not accelerate or slow this process. It simply contains it. Where this leads. By design, Polunsky strips life down to its bare essentials. It is not meant to punish through chaos, but through permanence. In the next part of this documentary, we will examine high-profile inmates who have passed through Polunsky. What happens when execution dates are set? And how the prison interfaces with Texas's execution process. Because at Polunsky, the end of the road is never abstract, it is scheduled. The final process. When an execution date is set. For most of a death row inmate's time at Polunsky, execution is an abstract possibility. That changes the moment an execution date is formally set. In Texas, execution dates are issued by a trial court judge after appellate options have narrowed. The date is typically scheduled weeks or months in advance, allowing time for final appeals. Once a date is set, Polunsky's role shifts. The inmate remains housed in the same cell, under the same restrictions, but the legal and administrative activity around him intensifies. Attorneys file last-minute motions. Courts review emergency petitions. Media attention increases. Inside the prison, the routine stays outwardly the same. But everything now points toward a single day. Final appeals and last motions. As the execution date approaches, inmates often pursue final appeals. These may include claims of ineffective assistance of counsel, new evidence arguments, mental competency challenges, appeals to federal courts or the U.S. Supreme Court. Most of these filings are denied. Stays of execution are rare and typically granted only if courts identify a substantial unresolved legal issue. For inmates at Polunsky, these legal efforts unfold entirely on paper. There is no courtroom appearance. No public hearing. News of a denial often arrives quietly, delivered by an attorney or prison official. Life at Polunsky after a date is set. When an execution date is pending, death row conditions do not fundamentally change. Inmates are not transferred to a different housing unit. They continue to eat alone, recreate alone, and remain isolated. However, visitation often increases. Clergy, attorneys, and family members may visit more frequently, subject to approval. These visits are still non-contact. For many inmates, this period becomes a time of reflection, legal urgency, and final conversations, all conducted through glass. The day of transfer. Executions in Texas are carried out at the Huntsville unit, not at Polunsky. On the day of execution, the inmate is transferred from Polunsky to Huntsville. The transfer typically occurs early in the morning. Security is tight. The movement is planned in advance. The route is controlled. Once the inmate leaves Polunsky, he will never return. For correctional staff, this process follows established protocol. For the inmate, it marks the final departure from the place where he may have spent decades. Polunsky after the execution. When an execution is carried out, Polunsky does not stop functioning. The cell is cleared. Records are updated. Another inmate may eventually be housed there. For those still on death row, daily life continues unchanged. Executions do not disrupt the routine. The system absorbs the loss and moves forward. This institutional continuity is deliberate, a reflection of how capital punishment is administered not as an event, but as a process. Declining death row numbers. Over the past 2 decades, Texas's death row population has steadily declined. Fewer death sentences are being imposed. Fewer executions are being carried out annually. Factors contributing to this trend include changes in jury behavior, life without parole as an alternative sentence, improved defense representation, evolving views on capital punishment. Despite this decline, Polunsky remains active. As long as Texas maintains the death penalty, the prison's core function remains unchanged. Criticism and defense of Polunsky. Polunsky exists at the center of a national debate. Critics argue that prolonged isolation on death row causes psychological harm and raises ethical concerns. Supporters argue that the prison's design is necessary for safety, order, and legal compliance. Courts have largely sided with the state, emphasizing deference to prison administrators. As a result, Polunsky remains largely unchanged from its original design. The debate continues, not inside the prison, but in courtrooms, legislatures, and public discourse. What Polunsky represents. The Allan B. Polunsky Unit is not a place most people will ever see. It operates quietly, consistently, and with little public visibility. For the men housed inside, it represents the longest chapter of their lives. For the state of Texas, it represents the enforcement of its most severe criminal sentence. Polunsky is not built for transformation. It is built for waiting. And in that waiting, it reveals more about the system that created it than about the individuals confined within its walls. Final reflection. Polunsky does not tell a single story. It holds hundreds of them, suspended in time, separated by walls, defined by a sentence that rarely changes. Understanding this prison is not about sensationalism. It is about understanding how a modern justice system handles final punishment, day after day, year after year, largely out of sight. Polunsky is one prison, but its purpose raises questions far beyond its walls. If you found this documentary valuable, consider subscribing for more fact-based deep dives into the world's most closed institutions. Leave a comment with your thoughts, and thank you for watching.